In the name of love, which transforms our lives. Amen. Today's Christmas story is a longtime favorite of mine. Perhaps you also look forward each year to our wise men carrying in their gifts and singing such beautiful solos. Thank you, gentlemen, for your gifts shared with us. And thank you also to David Long and Brian Vanderlecht and Jay Jansen, who were the ones who orchestrated these sparkling visuals over our head as we have been living into Christmastide. These symbols of the mysterious astrologers from the East who appear on the scene in the story as almost as suddenly as the celestial sign that they follow. These magi dare us to lift up our eyes as they did, to wonder where love is leading us in this new year. Now, whenever a new year starts off with a fresh wave of violence, including terrorist events fueled by religious extremism and the traumas of war, it can be very tempting to backpedal on our love, our commitment to love our neighbors and to love strangers. Yet this call of love, Jesus' love, undoubtedly guides each of us in this moment to stay that courageous course, to enter every corner of the world where God calls us to go in witness to the presence of Christ. Because love is always overcoming violence with wisdom. And the Magi embody such a picture of just what Paul was talking about, that rich and diverse wisdoms that God reveals in the world. Wisdom to inspire our moral courage in this new year. Today's joyful feast of the Epiphany sweeps us into these hymns that we know and love, and king cake traditions like coffee hour, and yes, we will chalk the doors of our parish hall and think about what it means to be on this journey of seeking to find Jesus in our lives. Even as we look into those layers of sweetness, seeing if we're going to be the lucky ones to get the baby Jesus in the king cake. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we need this invitation to turn toward the sweet aspects of human connection right now, because whenever our world is torn apart by religious or politically fueled violence that grips our attention, we need to recenter ourselves in love that resists violence. Now, you'll maybe have noticed, as I did, listening to Jenny read Isaiah and then later in the Matthew's gospel, that Matthew doesn't specifically call these wise ones kings. They are known as the Magi, but we did hear in the poetry of Isaiah that kings would stream to the brightness of the dawning of this child that was foretold by the prophet Isaiah. But Magi, maybe it's like, if you're like me, Magi makes me think of magician. You think of different and maybe perhaps even suspicious forms of wisdoms that maybe we're not ready quite to let in this moment. But I think it's important as we start this new year to be on the lookout for these diverse models of how love calls us to live in service to neighbor and seeing no stranger. So let's honor the strangeness of the Magi for just a moment, because while I think we live in a world where we would acknowledge that the single-minded devotion that they embody is commendable and noble, maybe even wise, we probably would call into question their choice to go toward danger, into the heart of a violent world, as they were on that journey to worship the newborn king who was born in those far-off, distant realms from where these wise ones lived. Now, I've always enjoyed the nativity scene and how the wise men come later on. It took them a little while to arrive. And if you look at the visual depictions of nativity scenes, you may notice that these wise ones from the east are wearing turbans not crowns in some instances. They were likely practitioners of Zoroastrianism, and turbans would have been a symbol of their spiritual commitments. Now, I'm not an expert, though when I was a child I did do the towel up, as my long hair was drying, and imagined myself as one of these ancient wise ones. But I have been enjoying reading Sikh American Valerie Kaur's book, Revolutionary Love, a story in which she describes her own epiphany about the traditional turbans that her family chose to wear to mark their identities as they lived and farmed for more than a century in Central California, in the agricultural community there. And the turban, though it did bring them into the limelight, and sometimes in not terrific ways, she did have people trying to cast the devil out of her and tell her she was going to hell unless she converted to Christianity, so that was not so hot. But the turban marked a visual symbol of the wisdom that they were committed to living from their Sikh faith, a faith that is devoted to the service of neighbor, a faith committed to loving in ways that spares no expense to protect the other, faith that celebrates the differences that are visible among human beings, alongside the truth of our interconnectedness and our belonging to each other. Now, I recognize the Sikh faith was not involved in the events that started out this new year, but there are often tendencies that human beings have to be suspicious in the aftermath of violence that's fueled by any form of religious extremism. And I think it bears saying that in this new year, we are called to be people who not only resist this tendency to other and look with suspicion on different faiths, but to recommit to this call that love issues forth in our lives, to see no one as a stranger. The Magi certainly did this. They had their own faith and their own traditions and their own cultures, and they brought those with them. They didn't shed them at the door when they were overwhelmed with joy, seeing the star stop over the place where Jesus was staying. These spiritual seekers from distant lands brought their unique gifts and wisdoms as they came to pay homage to the wisdom of God revealed in Jesus Christ. And in that encounter, there was deep resonance across diverse faith traditions. Wisdom reveals love's universalizing bond, drawing us in not only to connection with each other, but to service toward one another. Love calls forth our deepest bravery, and love does dare us to see no stranger. As Kaur talks about in her stories of struggle and stories of joy, growing up as a religious minority in this country with its dominant Christian narratives and culture, she notes that wonder is where love begins, but the failure to wonder is the beginning of violence. The Magi certainly begin with wonder. That's what brings them and us on this journey following the stars. And they find themselves amid Herod's lack of wonder, that place out of which his own violence is born. But they choose to say no. They disrupt his intent. They don't send word back to him about where Jesus and Mary and Joseph are. And their act of defiance has a strong possibility of landing them on his hit list. But they are more invested in the greater good, as we see in the gifts that they offer. These resources of gold and frankincense and myrrh, yes, have the symbolism that our hymn talked about, and they are also currencies in that era, ways in which these men could bring their resources to afford safe passage for Jesus and Mary and Joseph as they fled to Egypt to wait out Herod's terrible slaughter of the innocents. The Magi make sure Jesus can grow up in safety beyond Herod's reach. In the face of all these threats of violence, their quest is marked by joy. For in worshiping the newborn babe, they honor that divine image in Jesus and in themselves. And this is what love asks us all to do when it dares us to see no one as a stranger. Love brings forth our bravest aspiration, asking us to honor the divine image in every human being. It's the highest goal we can undertake in our earthly lives. So I'm grateful as we sit here under these sparkling visual reminders, especially in the aftermath of New Year's Day 2025. The light of love draws us to lead lives of costly service, lives that, like the Magi's own, demonstrate that we too can be people of wisdom who offer our gifts to make a difference, walking in the footsteps of all the wise ones who have ever gone to great lengths for love's sake. Whether or not we ever profess a shared faith, we can be people of love who serve with generous care, who recognize and celebrate how we are undeniably part of one another. Now, it might be hard to imagine taking a step toward the ones that are furthest away from us, and the Magi did have to traverse some distance to affirm the dignity that they knew was present in Jesus. We all might need to take stock this year about how we will recommit to discovering new ways to acknowledge and to give our hearts to discovering that you are a part of me I do not yet know. When we do, we discover our lives can be filled with transformative joy, drawing us into connections with our world's most vulnerable. So today, as we invoke these wise ones, Balthazar, Melchior, Caspar, as we chalk the doors of our parish halls and later our homes with the initials CMB 25, let us give our own hearts to the disarming wisdom of Christ that says love will be present with us wherever Christ calls us to go. For as another wise one once put it, we must dare to do every good, decent, honest, compassionate, and loving thing for as many as we possibly can, for as long as we possibly can. Maybe we too will live to be lucky centenarians whose souls reach for greatness born of faithful service. Yes, I am speaking of President Carter's commitment to wage peace, to fight disease, to build hope. And I hope we will choose to dedicate our diverse gifts, so many gifts in this room, so many ways that God is calling us to serve this wounded world that God so loves. I'm reminded of Mr. Carter's concluding words from his 2002 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech when he said, "The bond of our common humanity is stronger than the divisiveness of our fears and prejudices. God gave us the capacity for choice, and we can choose to alleviate suffering. We can choose to work together for peace. We can make these changes, and we must." As we reflect on all the ways that God is drawing us more deeply in the paths of love, let us close this morning with prayer. Holy wisdom, guide us in love's strange ways. Awaken our wonder and joy so that, like the Magi, we might overcome violence with love. Help us see no stranger in this newborn year, that we might serve all with generosity, courage, and compassion. Transform us by your love. Amen.